Good day, everyone. I'm Tammy Bond, the principal investigator of a project we've been calling RESPECT, Realism, Equity, and Salience in Projections of Energy-Coupled Transitions. The National Science Foundation supports us under growing convergence research, and this project was submitted with a slightly different name. Our aspiration is a paradigm shift in creating and using projections of socio-technical change. Now, that's quite a broad field, so we've chosen as a focal problem the electrification of homes, or transitioning houses to use electricity rather than fossil fuels. And you can see that this is consistent with the United States National Long-Term Strategy. Just for some grounding, electrification looks like this. 42% of the energy used in homes is for heating, and that means an electrified source such as heat pumps. So these are big decisions that people have to make one at a time. The trouble is that big decisions in homes look something like this, made among competing priorities with many other burdens to think of. So our presentation will cover our project overview, our convergence accomplishments, which we have to present first so that you can understand the research, followed by what we've done in research and our plans for phase 2.
We'd like to start with the national policy landscape for household electrification. There are two important objectives. The first is to accelerate the adoption of heat pumps by households in the US. And the second is to do so in a manner that translates a lot of the benefits of that transition to disadvantaged communities. Now, the reason why this is a challenge, if you look to the left, is that we have characterized a significant amount of energy insecurity distributed across the US households. And while we do have an increase in the sales of heat pumps, we don't know if that will be adequate to meet our goals. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was actually passed after the start of this project, intends to introduce incentives to accomplish these goals. Now, energy models would be useful for policymakers if they're able to represent realistically people's responsiveness to these incentives. And in our view, they currently do not.
The original project objectives covered individuals, institutions, model rates of change, equity, and integration. Those formal objectives are stated on the left-hand side of this slide. The questions on the right are easy to communicate with ourselves and others. What do people experience in their homes? How do institutions and organizations affect people when they make decisions about their homes? At what rate can technology change? Do technology transitions affect well-being equally, or do they contribute to inequities? And how can researchers and stakeholders connect differing perceptions on these topics? Our objectives evolve throughout the project. We recognize the need to integrate with and not duplicate work by national agencies like the U.S. Department of Energy. We needed to emphasize the contributions that an interdisciplinary team could make to enhance national policies and programs, particularly those aimed at underserved communities. We put extra time into the computational tools needed to communicate to other efforts, including developing an agent-based model that had not been promised. Because of that elevation in the national landscape, we also decided to pursue comprehensive reviews to connect the important concepts in our work to national and international communities. Neither of these were something we anticipated needing at the outset. Reviewer feedback highlighted the need to address the intersectional nature of individual and community well-being. One reviewer suggested we include a well-being expert, but we wanted to infuse an agnostic and encompassing view throughout every aspect of our project. We enhanced our consultation project, integrating insights from experts and community stakeholders to ensure that our approach is inclusive and well-rounded. Our understanding and approach to community engagement evolved significantly. Finally, we heard again and again that household change was limited by the role of contractors as intermediaries. We had proposed to address this in phase 2, but our inquiry shifted from an econometric approach to observing closer to practice. This meant we removed an investigator and recrafted future tasks.
In the next section, we will show you our convergence accomplishments from our starting point, how we converged throughout the project. So first of all, who are we as a team? One special part of our team is the different disciplines and methods we cover. So some of us are from engineering departments, some from sociology and political science, and we have various backgrounds, from working on decent living standards and well-being to technology transitions and modeling. And we managed to make a big step towards connecting these areas.
Our approach to convergence can be represented by a pyramid of practices, from integrated to targeted exercises to expert guidance.
The base of the pyramid and the most frequent activity was weekly meeting. The team as a whole had to meet weekly basis, and we also had separate regular meetings to focus on data synthesis and writing. And I just joined the team in last August, and I really benefited from the team where I could get to share ideas and collaborate with others.
All those meetings were stored on a group YouTube channel so that people could catch up or be onboarded. The tip of the pyramid and least frequent was guidance from experts in team science. We participated in the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, and we contracted with the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences, or IRIS, to help us with other workshops and advise on the team structure. One of the really important parts that we brought to Convergence was targeted exercises that we developed ourselves based in group facilitation practices. Whether it was follow-up on the IRIS workshops, a jam board during the weekly meetings, a crazy idea board during the project kickoff, or grappling with our own mental models of landscape change just recently, these exercises were really critical in developing trust and a shared vision. In order to achieve convergence, we had to embrace divergence and recognize its sources. We had to ask, why hasn't convergence occurred already? What are the barriers? Some of those sources of divergence were methodological, the scales at which we work, and the kind of information we considered valid, the instinct to own methods in a field, and differing motivations for engagement. It's difficult to demonstrate how we implement these throughout the project, but they underpin everything that we do.
One of the ways we did this was to recognize that we were all talking about the same things throughout the objectives: heterogeneity, well-being, and the way change occurs. These ideas become conceptual boundary objects that all members of the team discussed throughout the project.
We started with natural divisions among qualitative and quantitative researchers, and within the quantitative researchers, there was a division between statistical and dynamical approaches. We recognized that external stakeholders would bring completely different perspectives. By our last in-person meeting, we recognized that some of these divisions had died away as we discussed problems. We've come to understand each other's approaches, and now we are more limited by available data.
So we have now created a new mental map of how our work connects. It follows the flow of information that we communicate with each other. And it also explains how we connect findings from the nationally representative data down to the local scales where we get rich data and then back up again to gauge how our work is relevant. Some key things that we have developed are the ability to identify relevant samples, factors that govern these samples, and when they apply to other situations using the framework of context, mechanism, outcome, configurations.
The number of stakeholders relevant to housing is huge. We came to recognize that there were many diverse organizations we needed to listen to inform our work, agencies we needed to share out to who would benefit from our work, and groups to collaborate and integrate with who also benefit people at home but have different scopes and target communities. They all have different motivations and methods of practice aimed at improving home environments. An important part of our current and future work is recognizing these different motivations and designing fair engagement practices for each type of group.
We have begun to have conversations with government agencies who are very interested in the data we've been creating, especially Fusion ACS and the incorporation of well-being that was made possible by this project. And they're very interested in us using these data to help understand and interpret the Justice 4D initiative.
In terms of listening, many implementing organizations have to struggle with how national and state policies show up on the ground. We attend monthly meetings of the Healthy Housing Coalition, even when we don't have anything to report or ask, a practice we call showing up at the well. We hear about challenges in conducting electrification, but we also hear about competing priorities like radon mitigation or housing affordability, and the pluses and minuses of using inspections to achieve rental quality. We didn't start the coalition, but common interests among those members will keep it going long after our project is over. Through this connection, we found many of the advisors who participated in a focus group on our interview script.
And with regard to diversifying, some of our team members work and collaborate outside of this project on engineering aspects of home energy efficiency and indoor air quality, including another NSF team project. Those relationships include connections to the Building Performance Association, which organizes conferences for energy contractors. Although the engineering work itself remains outside of the scope of RESPECT, it provides a connection to a stakeholder ecosystem that we can serve.
We've now acknowledged an explicit difference between what we offer to and receive from different stakeholders, as shown in the outer loop that we call the discourse cycle.
We've begun to utilize some of the analysis and data that we've developed at the local scale to inform national models. We have already had conversations with people at the Department of Energy who are very interested in our modifications to NEMS.
Our attention to developing a common vision is supported by an independent assessment of network growth between the first year and second years. This is an empirical measurement of growth of convergence. Two of the measures that were assessed were team members learning from each other and the discussion of joint research. So the degree metric is each team member's average number of connections, and the density is the percentage of connection out of all possible connections. So the team has become more connected with threefold increase in both measures.
After about a year, the original division we had, where individuals led discussions among quantitative or qualitative teams, became too limiting. We transitioned to a model that included postdocs, students, junior researchers, and senior researchers leading products and thrusts that interacted with each other as the network coalesced.
You've seen what we practiced and how our convergence developed, and this is coming forward in the journal papers that are slated for completion in phase 1, which ends in September 2024. 8 of these papers are submitted or on track to be submitted during phase 1, and 2 more are expected by December. These papers include specialized topics within subgroups, as well as crossover work that could not have been accomplished within individual disciplines. We will illustrate these convergence accomplishments in the research section that follows. Nursima, can you characterize the state of national data?
Yeah, we found there's 4 types of information that are important for understanding energy and well-being and adoption decisions. Socio-demographic information, the physical condition of homes, the provisioning systems that serve people, and their own perception of their well-being. Generally, these data exist in specialized surveys that are disconnected from each other with fairly small samples, which prevents us from understanding the intersections of these conditions at a fine spatial scale. And secondly, even each of these surveys doesn't ask the kinds of questions we would want to ask about how energy behavior affects well-being.
So bringing well-being into an aspect of the data, how can you use Fusion ACS to address the limitations?
What we've tried to do is extract as much information from these surveys by putting them together. Using machine learning techniques, we've guessed at how the ACS respondents would answer these specialized surveys. So it gives an expected characterization of these intersections at a fine spatial scale.
What's your vision for how this moves the future of research and modeling forward?
We can start with drawing correlations and hypotheses about the intersections. So for example, how do material deprivations translate into people's view of life satisfaction? We may also, where we're comfortable, define decision rules for how we improve on models. And where we don't have confidence, we can guide future data collection. So one aspect that's really important is understanding operating conditions for people in different physical stocks. And for that, I'd like to turn to my colleague Zara.
Building on the enrolled national heterogeneous data, we employed RESTEC housing characterization to project energy demand and operating costs across different demographics, because this can directly impact household well-being. With this data foundation, we developed a computational algorithm to create insights by integrating residential well-being variables with energy data.
Using the Fusion ACS dataset, we investigated how other deprivations such as housing, mobility, and food are associated with how households evaluate their life. What we found is that all of these deprivations significantly lower life satisfaction, but amongst these, energy is the one that contributes the most significantly, as seen by a decrease of score of 0.5 on the figure here. In terms of income, that would roughly translate to about $40,000 of annual household income. So these are just results from a national data set. So I'd be curious to know from Ellison and Zara what you've been finding from surveys at a smaller scale.
Through this review, studies consistently measured physical comfort factors like temperature and indoor air quality, as well as indicators of psychological and mental health. There are also a high proportion of studies that directly measure subjective well-being and life satisfaction. Measures in these smaller scale field studies show some overlap with Karthik's national scale work. This overlap and areas lacking overlap form the basis for guidance we are developing about what, why, and how decisions about well-being measures are realistically chosen across different scales of research and practice. For instance, Karthik's work demonstrated that energy deprivation significantly impacts life satisfaction, yet measures of energy deprivation in the home are surprisingly absent from our field-based studies. We also think there's insight to be gained from you, Chris, and we'd love to hear your reflections on the interviews you've had.
We found that well-being is very much connected to energy and energy transitions within the home. Over half the people we interviewed said that they achieve well-being in their home when they are comfortable. So when the temperature's right for them, when their systems are working properly, this is when they feel most comfortable. And they also experience well-being when they feel safe and secure.
On a national scale, Karthik's data were able to quantify how energy insecurity reduces life satisfaction. From Chris's interviews, we hear that thermal comfort is an important part of well-being at home, but not the only part. And that's what people are measuring, according to Ellison's and Zara's review. However, field studies don't have the same basis as data used for household energy simulations. This view was possible only by combining qualitative exploration, formal well-being constructs, and data fusion that bridged well-being and material deprivations. This gap presents an opportunity for alignment.
So Narsima, you have been looking into modeling reviews. So how would you say that current existing model demonstrating modeling energy system decision-making process?
We see a large gap between how energy models represent house adoption decisions and what we see in the social science literature about the various factors that influence these choices. So energy models tend to represent households very simply using just an economic payback criteria, when in fact in the literature we see that there are two stages to the decision. One is whether or not to change your equipment at all, and the second considers the factors that influence the choice of equipment. Now, I know that you have worked with agent-based models. What have you found about the state of knowledge about how they represent these decisions?
Yeah, so ABM is very capable of capturing different behavioral factors in people's decision or energy transition. But what they usually do is that they assume those variables that are important to make changes, but they do not necessarily explain well why those variables are prioritized over others. These are studies focusing on one point at a time. Christine, can you tell us about what type of data set you are using and why is it different from what we have seen so far?
Yes, so the snapshots in time cannot look at changes that influence heat pump adoption. So we created a longitudinal data set that follows the same housing unit over time. And that way we can focus on prior equipment and household conditions and their changes. We found that changing prior equipment like stoves or hot water systems to electricity and having prior central electric air conditioning can positively influence heat pump adoption. But overall, the explanation with available data is still limited. So next, we want to combine that with other data sources. So now we're moving from the national surveys to local microdata. Ryan, can you tell us more about your analysis?
We collected mechanical permit data from 3 communities in Colorado to create a database of tens of thousands of observed changes in home heating and cooling, along with corresponding rules, neighborhood, and building characteristics. While we had expected to observe a strong role of local incentives and rules, we quickly learned we had a limited understanding of contractors as part of the regulatory system. For example, in an early finding, we showed that lower resourced homeowners hire more well-trained contractors. Because our dataset records contractor-resident technology interactions, we plan to leverage it to continue exploring how intermediaries shape electrification outcomes and ultimately residential comfort.
Now switching to the qualitative data, what did you find, Chris, that is not measured in the quantitative data?
Of the 25 residents we interviewed so far, all of the participants have pointed to some kind of tipping point. Over half of them reported that the trigger for them personally was reaching a state of discomfort, that the status quo was no longer tolerable. While we think of thermal comfort in being generally important to well-being, many of the interview participants placed particular emphasis on becoming so hot that they had to make an energy-related change then and there. As more than a few people mentioned, it was their misery that prompted the change.
Now, our Simmons review showed that decisions occur in a two-step process. Through interviews, we hear that heat stress leads people to consider the first step of change in addition to equipment age. And for the second step of selecting equipment, Christina's longitudinal study shows that prior equipment has an influence on what people choose. From Ryan's permit data combined with Chris's interviews of those people, we hear that contractors are really key in constraining the choice set, while cost is important but not treated as a minimization problem. How do these findings affect the stories we can tell? We need simulations of acceptance and transition rates that combine heterogeneity, well-being, and a view of change relying on actual factors so that we can bring realistic simulations to create storylines for energy policymakers. Raidul, can you tell us about the model that's coming forward?
Yeah, so we are really interested in what is the likelihood of people's transition to different energy efficient system depending on their social economic status. And we are trying to take advantage of the heterogeneous data set that we have built for. And we have seen that Colorado is demonstrating a lot of heterogeneity. So we are tackling that first, but we want to extend that to the whole national level analysis. And we have been collaborating with each other, trying to understand how this can be converged together to shape the modeling framework overall. This is kind of a snapshot of what the modeling framework looks like. There are different data heterogeneity introduced to it, and we are formulating the narrative or decision-making based on what Chris and other people are seeing in their qualitative and quantitative analysis. We want to capture those behavioral characteristics into a national level model that Shanghai is implementing. Shanghai, can you tell us how would you capture this behavioral dynamics into your NIMS model?
The first, NIMS is a very important model developed by Energy Information Agency. It is widely used for policy-making process decision. The NIMS do model the two-stage decision, but the problem is the parameters they use are pretty arbitrary, and it's only one residential sector. So you cannot really model the household heterogeneity. What we want to do is that we want to do some incremental change. The final goal is to make it more realistic to inform policy-making process.
We've been sharing our work in the cycles framework to show how convergence has occurred, but all of those elements connect to the objectives and tasks that we originally proposed. For accountability, we're showing how close those tasks are to completion. Phase 1 is finished in September of 2024, and most of the tasks are on track to be completed. There were a couple that demonstrated extra complexity, not just in our work, but throughout the community, and those are being redesigned. And some unforeseen tasks, like the reviews, will also be completed in Phase 1. We'd like now to share our plans for Phase 2. After opening up the space to diverse perspective and figuring out what the right things are to do, we can begin to contemplate how to do those things right. It doesn't mean we stop diverging and converging. It just means that we're more confident in directions for moving forward. That second diamond has a lot of instruction in the design literature, but we had to define for ourselves what it means in research. We have work left to do on the framework, and that's development, and especially the ways of making connections between scales. We've discovered that available data may not be suited to ask the questions we need to answer, so some targeted gathering is needed. But the goal of all this work is to deliver benefit outside our team. People, organizations, and agencies often recognize the complexity of this topic, but they don't know what to do about it. So we need to develop practices to help them expand their own work. Finally, we need to enrich policy discussions by distilling some of the richness and realism that we know exists. What we'll do in phase 2 will be presented according to its position on the cycle diagram and classified by its contribution, solidifying, supporting, gathering, and enriching. Most activities don't need to contribute in every category.
Before we outline the specific activities, we'd like to share 3 questions that emerged because of and through our phase 1 work. Question 1, can contractors and implementers enhance or suppress technology uptake on local, regional, and national levels? As an example of how answers to this question might inform policy, policies might address the causes of contractor hesitations to try new equipment rather than providing only occupant-focused incentives. Our second question is, how do competing deprivations affect the well-being response to changes in the home environment? And our third question is, will perceptions of heat stress accelerate the urgency of and demand for electrification?
We will develop guidelines for the research team to engage with and continue to hear from the complex ecosystems of agencies, policymakers, implementers, and contractors who play differing but important roles in influencing household energy decisions. We aim to elucidate the gaps between policy and implementation and seek out opportunities to enrich the discourse towards inclusion, justice, and solutions for heterogeneous stakeholders.
We would like to further downscale our existing Fusion ACS dataset down to the census tract level, which is where existing data screening tools are also operative at. We would also like to make Fusion ACS dataset available for policy integration. An example of this would be having the means to host a dataset either with the EPA or the Census Bureau. Finally, we would also like to communicate our connections of well-being and material deprivations to stakeholders outside the energy community.
We plan to solidify our existing permit sample and utilize it to support team efforts. Our enhanced dataset will be useful in identifying, for example, contractors for interviews based on their observed differences in their electrification outcomes, levels of training, or utilization of government rebates. By scaling up our methods and developing a national sample of permitted electrification, we can connect our local data efforts in Colorado with the team's national efforts, such as Fusion ACS. It can also be used for sampling for the national survey NARCIMA will introduce in a few slides.
PSM workshops will produce a causal model of household change that can be used to improve ABMs and surveys. As we continue to refine the participatory mapping script, we will strategically target groups that were underrepresented in our interview samples. For example, we would like to hear more from intermediaries, such as those who administer local assistance programs. We also want to hear more from contractors and the complex role they fill in energy transitions.
As part of our phase 2 work, we will operationalize the selection of well-being indicators to ensure they're relevant and practical across various scales. We will formalize methods to connect these indicators with national data using the context mechanism outcome configuration, and this approach will help us systematically understand the relationships between different factors influencing well-being and ensure comparability across studies.
In phase 1, we learned that we have few generalizable insights on the 2-stage adoption decision to improve models. And so we propose to conduct a national survey of recent heat pump adopters using sampling mechanisms developed in Colorado by Ryan and scaled up to the national level. We would also like to suggest new questions for national surveys, such as in an energy survey, elicit information about people's adaptive preferences to comfort.
During phase 2, the agent-based model and its soft link with names will include heat stress as a driver of change among heterogeneous population. The microsimulation model will also include contractor as an influencing actor. Output from such integration will then be used to inform policymakers about the future landscape.
The work we're doing is all about contributing to national discussions about the energy transition. We need to be able to better communicate those to policymakers and respond to inquiries about influences of potential policies. We'll be participating in a multi-sector dynamics group at the Department of Energy and developing paths to policy support by placing interns in organizations. In phase 2, we plan to continue the pyramid of convergence. Our integrated practices of weekly meetings will continue. We've also learned by working with IRIS that expert guidance combined with our own implementation can be extremely powerful. So we'll seek consultation with organizations that have learned to operate in communities, such as the Institute for the Built Environment at Colorado State University. Finally, we need to continue targeted exercises and regular in-person all-hands meetings. It's when we are together that we really move the convergence forward. Thank you for listening to our presentation and for your support.